Live from our studio centre here in Moscow, where it's just turned 8 p.m, this is RT. President Putin has warned against a military attack on Syria without the UN Security Council's approval. The Russian leader said punitive measures can take place only under international authorization and if there is solid evidence the Syrian regime gassed civilians. RT's Sean Thomas brings us the details.
President Vladimir Putin was doing an interview with the Associated Press and Russia's First Channel. And in that interview, he strongly cautioned the West against unilateral action against Syria. He also said that if the United States has strong and conclusive evidence that it was the Assad regime that used chemical weapons, then it must be handed over to the UN Security Council so that it can be analyzed and discussed in a global environment. In terms of the investigation that is happening with the UN and the alleged use of chemical weapons, he said that the world community needs to wait until that investigation is finished. We know that those inspectors are out of the country and that information is being analyzed right now. But he did say that he's not convinced that it was the Assad regime that used chemical weapons, citing the fact that President Assad and his army have made significant gains and advances in the Syrian civil war and that he's not desperate. Listen to what he had to say about that fact.
We think it would be totally absurd for the regular government forces to use banned chemical weapons in a situation where they've encircled the so-called rebels in certain areas and basically are about to finish them off. They're fully aware of the fact that such a step would mean sanctions, including even the use of force. This is just absurd. It doesn't make any sense.
Now, in terms of the now famous video that is circulated around YouTube, we heard Secretary of State from the United States, John Kerry, bring that up as one of the reasons why the U.S. should get involved. The president did address that as well. He said that this video is horrific, but it raises some questions. We don't know who these children are. We don't see parents. We don't see doctors in there. The president did reiterate he wants to wait for there to be more solid evidence from the UN and their team on the ground to basically justify any action going through international laws. Now, in a separate statement, after a meeting with the Human Rights Council, a nonprofit organization, Vladimir Putin talked about the United States Congress and the fact that they are in the process of debating the use of force and have actually drafted a resolution to be voted by the full Congress later on this month. He basically said that it was unacceptable to even consider using force outside of UN conventions. This is what he had to say.
The question of authorizing the use of force is being discussed by the Congress and the Senate, but it is an absolute common sense substitution. In international law, the Congress of no country can sanction such a thing. What they're trying to authorize is aggression, because everything outside the UN Security Council is aggression.
Vladimir Putin has often come under fire for what is thought to be a strong alliance with the Bashar al-Assad regime. He had this to say. He said that we do not defend Assad or his regime. Instead, Russia defends international law. He also went on to say that it is dangerous when you start entertaining questions about the use of force when it comes to not going through UN conventions. So a lot being said today on the subject of Syria from Russia's president.
RT Sean Thomas there. Well, you can find out what else Russia's president had to say during his interview in the full version, available right now on our website, rt.com. Well, meanwhile, the US president said relations with Vladimir Putin regarding Syria have hit the wall, but expressed hope Russia would change its stance. Barack Obama was speaking in Sweden as he rallies support both at home and abroad for a potential strike. Earlier, top US lawmakers agreed on a resolution giving President Obama a 90-day window for military action, but bars American boots on the ground. Let's go to New York and RT's Marina Portnaya for more on this. Marina, take us through Obama's latest statements on Syria and those plans to strike.
Well, U.S. President Barack Obama says that when it comes to the use of chemical weapons in Syria, it's not his credibility that is on the line. He says it's the credibility of the international community. He was referring to the statements that he made a year ago when he said that if chemical weapons were used in Syria, it would be a red line for him. Now he's saying that those statements reinforced a red line which was imposed by the international community. A red line, he says, that are upheld by international treaties and international norms. And he said it's important for the international community and for the American Congress to enforce the treaties that have been put in place. But while the U.S. leader is stressing the importance of these international agreements, he did say on Saturday that he feels very comfortable striking Syria without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. And that's because U.S. officials believe that the Council is in deadlock and that any resolution that would propose the use of force or intervention in Syria would be vetoed by Russia and or China. Now, at a press conference in Stockholm, Sweden, the U.S. leader also said that it is difficult for him to make a decision to use military force in Syria, but as difficult as that decision is, he believes that the moral thing to do is not to stand by and do nothing.
Well, we should act internationally. Well, sometimes, because of the various alignments, it's hard to act through a Security Council resolution. And so either we resign ourselves to saying there's nothing we can do about it, and we'll just shake our heads and go about our business, or we make decisions even when they're difficult. And I think this is an example of where we need to make decisions even though they're difficult, and I think it's important for Congress to be involved in that decision.
When asked what he will do if Congress rejects the president's request to use military force, Mr. Obama did not rule out going ahead with his plan without the approval of Congress. He also drew a distinction between Iraq and Syria, insisting that the evidence that his administration has and the report that they have concluded upon against the Assad regime is much more robust than the intelligence about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction, which subsequently proved to be wrong. Now, with regards to Russia, President Obama says that while Washington and Moscow still have their disagreements, and Moscow has disagreed with Obama's stance so far, he used the phrase resisted logic with the U.S. He believes that he will still continue to engage Russian President Vladimir Putin and hold out hope that the Russian leader may change his position and align more with the position of the United States when it comes to the chemical weapon use in Syria and making the regime of Bashar al-Assad suffer consequences for allegedly using chemical weapons.
And as Obama is heading towards Russia for this G20, what sort of support is he getting back home from the people there for these intervention plans?
Well, from the American people or the American politicians, there's two different elements of support. Let's start with the politicians. The top congressional leaders are beginning to line up behind President Obama's plan to launch a punitive airstrike on Syria. Now, the Republican House leadership has already indicated that they would back military intervention in Syria in response to the alleged use of chemical weapons. Meanwhile, as we've already been reporting, the State Foreign Relations Committee is set to vote on a compromise draft resolution for authorizing the use of military force in Syria. The text reportedly sets a 60-day deadline for action with a 130-day extension possible. But it also, according to reports, bars any ground forces, and a final Senate resolution would eventually need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster by opponents. Now, on Tuesday, Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Morton Dempsey, all testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee advocating a U.S. strike on Syria. Kerry said that the world's eyes are on Washington now to see if the government speaks with one voice and rises to the moment. The U.S.'s top diplomat also said if the U.S. does not take action against Damascus, America's allies may suspend their support for the White House's initiatives in the future. But in the meantime, after over a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the polls show that Americans are opposed to any new overseas military intervention. And that national sentiment has been reflected by senators and representatives who believe that the Obama administration still hasn't produced concrete evidence that it was Bashar al-Assad's supporters and his government that used chemical weapons on August 21st. So there's a lot of skepticism still against this plan that President Obama and his administration is campaigning for, that ultimately would lead to a military strike against the Syrian government.
Marina, thanks for that. RT's Marina Portnar live there in New York. Now, French lawmakers have gathered to debate whether the country should take part in action against Assad. There's going to be no vote on the matter this time, as French President François Hollande insists he alone has the power to order an attack, despite polls suggesting people want Parliament to have its say on the issue. RT's Tessa Rasilia has been looking at the French perspectives.
The French President, François Hollande, is constitutionally able to order an attack without a parliamentary approval. But François Hollande has been under a lot of pressure from opposition to put this issue to a vote. The opposition had also pointed out that Hollande is in a quote-unquote humiliating position of having to wait for what the U.S. says before acting. Now, a spokesman from Hollande's office said that the president hasn't yet decided whether or not to ask for a vote. Now, Hollande said, though, that France will not go it alone and will wait for the outcome of the U.S. congressional vote. And all of this comes on the back of a report presented to Parliament by the Prime Minister regarding the chemical attack near Damascus last month, which they say is responsible for 281 deaths. The report says, though, that, quote, it could not have been ordered or carried out by anyone other than the Syrian government. Now, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, in the meantime, had given an interview to French newspaper Le Figaro and warned that should there be an attack, chaos and extremism would ensue. And he also said there's a risk of a regional war, and warned that France would become an enemy of the Syrian state should they go ahead with this attack. Now, we spoke earlier with a French senator to discuss France's stance on a military intervention in Syria. The French intelligence has said that they presented proof and they found that Assad is guilty of this chemical attack.
I think we must be very cautious and we must wait for the decision of United Nations experts. Because remember, in 2003, the proofs were forged. And it was a disaster for Iraq and for the world economy.
As far as public opinion goes, one of the recent polls say that 59% of the French are against a military intervention in Syria by the government. Reporting from Paris, I'm Tessa Rasilia.
RT Live here in Moscow. Coming up, the man who made Snowden's leaks possible is offered police protection in Brazil. That's as the UK government's attempt